Can you hear me, bro?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. And just so you know, we have started streaming. We're just a few minutes to the event itself, but we wanted to make sure that the stream was working. So we should be streaming live on both YouTube and Facebook right now. It's good to see you. Good to see you both. And I think Brahmachari ji from Georgetown is joining us as well as one of our illustrious co-hosts of this gathering.
Lackluster.
I don't think that's true, but so we're just going to give it a minute or two, and then I will let everyone else in from the waiting room and offer some words of welcome, and then turn it over to our kind of moderated conversation, Q&A, back and forth.
I feel so uneducated because I'm not surrounded by bookshelves with lots of books that I've read.
Well, Maya. Even the books are Maya, right? Lovely to see you, Jay and Murliji. And Vineet, always a pleasure.
Likewise, likewise.
How many students or participants are we expecting from your end?
That is the $1 million question. So we don't require any kind of registration or RSVP for events of this sort. So
Sure.
we just try to keep an open door policy, and we've got, I think, what is it now? A couple of dozen. We've got a little less than that, 22 waiting in the waiting room right now. But folks also like to tune in on YouTube or on Facebook or watch it later. So
could you send those links, YouTube and Facebook, and I can post them quickly on my Facebook profile. So if anybody and send those to a couple different groups that I'm in on WhatsApp and such.
Yeah, let me do that. Do you want me to do that now?
Yeah, if you could, you can either if you text it to me, it'd be better because then I can because I've closed a lot of apps on my computer. If it's possible, otherwise I can always send it. If it'll be on YouTube, it can be sent after the fact as well.
Yeah, let's just do that actually. So that, because I'm a little hesitant to take myself away from this screen right now, and but I'll definitely do that.
And will there be live participation from any audience members?
So we are going to open it up for questions. Just sort of given logistics, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite folks to private chat me questions so that I can continue to moderate. But we'll sort of play it by ear if that's okay. I think, we may have enough of a sort of a robust conversation that in the interest of time, we may not necessarily get to have a full-on Q&A.
Sure.
But, we'll see where it goes. Is that all right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay, sure. So hang on. We'll just wait another minute or so, and I will start to admit folks in from the waiting room. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this really exciting conversation. We are also streaming this conversation on YouTube Live, and of course it will live forevermore on YouTube as a recording. So we always welcome folks to go back to tune in again or to share the link with others. And you can find that on the Hindu Life Program YouTube channel. I'll put the link in the chat box in a little bit. We are also, as I said, streaming on Facebook. So we'll make that link available to folks as well. And I know that there are some who are joining us on that platform too. But for those of us in the Zoom especially, I'm so grateful that you're here. We have a great crowd and it looks like folks are still streaming in. We do ask, just as a minor housekeeping note, that everyone just please do make sure that you are muted out. We've all been there, I think, where we think we're muted out and then we suddenly find we are not. And it's usually at the most inopportune moments that we find we're not. So again, we're all a community. We're gathered here. I think this will be a really great opportunity to kind of have some real talk. But to make that the most focused opportunity it can be, we just ask you take a second now, make sure you are muted out, make sure you stay muted out so we're not distracted or distracting each other. Let me say just a few words of welcome, and then I am really eager to hear from our special guest speakers and conversation partners. But this is an offering from the Hindu Life Program at Princeton University, and we are so delighted to actually be partnering with our dear counterparts at Georgetown University. So we have with us Brahmachari Vrajvihari Sharanji, who is the director of Dharmic Life and the Hindu chaplain and Dharmic chaplain at Georgetown University. And so we're so delighted that we get to partner with Georgetown on this. And we also have the partnership of the Hindu Life Program from Yale University and my dear colleague and spiritual sister, Dr. Asha Shipman. So this is just a really great coming together of these three programs to be able to host a conversation like this. I'm going to do something a little atypical. Generally, at this time, I offer a more formal introduction to our speakers, and usually read out their bios. I'm not going to do that this time around. I'm not going to do that because I would love for our speakers to introduce themselves, and so the first question that I'll ask them will give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and contextualize themselves in terms of the conversation at hand. But I want to use this time to tell you a little bit more about this event and the thinking behind it and why I really do feel like we're so blessed to have Murli and Jay with us and why they really are the right fit for a conversation like this. In thinking about hosting an event like this or a conversation like this, I'll be honest, there was some trepidation, there was some concern. And that concern had to do with a kind of a tension that on the one hand, we really wanted to engage on the issues. We really wanted to delve into this exploration of where are the Hindu American voices in the lead up to the US presidential elections? How do each candidate or their party or platform resonate with or challenge and offer a point of contention with the Hindu American community? We wanted to really explore this topic because we feel, frankly, it needs to be explored. And we'll get into that a little bit. That was one side. On the other side, however, there was some real concern that conversations like this can so quickly devolve and can bring out our lowest selves. And as folks committed to the spiritual values and principles of Hindu tradition, of Dharmic traditions, more widely understood, we're folks that care deeply about things like ahimsa, creating as the least amount of harm, contributing to the least amount of harm, or the beautiful principle of ekatva, seeing the commonality and the oneness and the interconnectedness rather than feeding into the forces of and the rhetoric of division. And we're in such a politically fraught time that there was some real concern. Can we have a conversation like this and still honor ahimsa and still honor ekatva and still honor dharma? Or does everything quickly devolve into hateful, divisive, us against them rhetoric. And as part of this process, and the reason that I'm taking the time to share this background with you all is I came to a conclusion, and in consultation with friends and colleagues, I can say we came to the conclusion that it is better to not do a conversation than to do it in a way that's going to contribute to harm. And so we were fully prepared to basically skip this opportunity if we couldn't ensure that we had the right people at the table and the right consciousness. And I say all of that just to let you know how delighted and how excited I am that I think we really have found the right people. I think in bringing Murli Balaji and Jay Kansara together to have this conversation, a robust conversation, a conversation where they're not going to be afraid to disagree with each other, but a conversation that is so deeply rooted in a commitment to these principles, and a commitment to civil, thoughtful discourse. That's what excites me. That's what to me tells me that what we're doing here has real value and real purpose and real promise. I'll share this one last bit about Murli and Jay, and then I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and to contextualize for us what brings them to the table. But Murli and Jay are friends. They are former colleagues. Interestingly, both of them worked side by side in some respects at the Hindu American Foundation, really working towards advocacy, towards understanding, towards engagement for Hindu Americans. Both of them committed to that while they were at HAF, and while neither of them is at HAF presently, they remain committed to those principles and those ideals and that drive to advocate for and to engage our blessed Hindu American community. And so I think they bring with them that spirit, and they bring those principles and that commitment into this conversation. And so we're so excited and delighted to have them with us. Please, I know you're muted out. Please stay muted out, but from the comfort of your homes or your offices, wherever you're joining us from, please give a very warm Princeton University, Georgetown University, and Yale University welcome to Murli Balaji and Jay Kansara. So friends, I'm going to jump right into, as I said, the first question, which is more or less a request for each of you to introduce yourselves, to tell us about you as individuals and as Hindu Americans, and what brings you as individuals, as Hindus, as Hindu Americans, to support the candidates you support, and how do each of you see yourselves in the respective campaigns that you're working for and that you are attempting to serve. And perhaps, Jay, could you start us off?
Sure. Namaste, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on either Sunday morning or afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. When Vineet brought this conversation to my attention and the invitation, I was very humbled by this opportunity to speak to such an illustrious audience. You know, I would say my parents should be proud of me that I get to talk to Princeton, Georgetown, and Yale all in one session, and and so I am very grateful. Murli and I, yes, were colleagues at the Hindu American Foundation for many years, and our desks were either beside each other or in the neighboring rooms in our office in downtown Washington, D.C. And we both brought a very passionate and dedicated spirit of service to our duty, or our dharma, to support the Hindu American community through advocacy, through nonpartisan, non-political, or I wouldn't say non-political, but nonpartisan engagement to ensure that our community's interests were heard by all of those who were at the, in seats of power, so that they could effectively legislate or, or create policy on behalf of our community. And I'm very grateful to actually be reunited with Morley. It's been some time since I've actually been in the same room with him or in a conversation with him. And my experience, so I was at the Hindu American Foundation for 9 years, from 2010 through 2019. And the experience that I'm bringing to the table right now is from my own personal lived experience, and why I feel that re-electing President Donald Trump is critical for not just the Hindu American community, or more broadly speaking, as we're often subsumed within that identity, the Indian American community, but just for America itself. So I'll give some background about myself. I'm originally from Texas. I worked at the, I went to the University of Texas at Austin, and then within 2 years of graduating from the University of Texas, I joined the Hindu American Foundation as a staff member. And I had actually worked for Republican Governor Rick Perry in Texas as an intern for 1.5 years through my academic work there, but I have voted for Democrats in every presidential election until 2016. I voted for John Kerry because I believed that we needed to end the Iraq War because it was erroneous. And it was a false pretense by which we had engaged in that war, and it destabilized. It was on this path to very violently destabilizing the Middle East. I did vote for President Obama in 2008 over John McCain for similar reasons, because I felt President Obama was going to bring a responsible end to the war, and he was going to usher in an era of accountability in American government. Especially with the financial crisis that had been that had just transpired, or was, we were beginning to see the ramifications of that in the economy. And as a recent college graduate, I was definitely feeling those ramifications. And I chose to vote for President Obama again, although hesitantly. I did vote for him again because I felt that his execution of bringing Osama bin Laden to justice was something that was much needed, and he did so in a way that effectively did unite the country at that point in time. However, when it came to the 2016 election, I was extremely disillusioned. As my role at the Hindu American Foundation was to be the director of government relations, and so I was the face of our community and the organization on the Hill at executive agencies, most importantly the State Department, where I was able to bring knowledge and information about the persecution of Hindu human rights to the powers that be. And consistently, the point that we had always addressed with the administration was that aid money that had gone to countries where Hindus were sizable yet persecuted minorities was always being misappropriated within those communities, within those societies, and the plight of the Hindu community was always getting worse. And in no country is that more prevalent than in Pakistan, as I'm sure our guests and the leaders on the panel know that today. And when Hillary Clinton had won the nomination, I knew, actually when she was campaigning for the nomination of the Democratic ticket, I knew that I could never vote for her, because I saw firsthand what her and her State Department, how they ignored these facts, how they failed to address them effectively. And so I cast my ballot actually for the Libertarian candidate. And I was, as I admitted that, or as I proclaimed that to many of my friends in my circle, I was oftentimes blamed for having been part of contributing to Donald Trump's election. And so while I could not necessarily get myself to vote for Donald Trump in that moment in time, I was in some ways very relieved that Hillary Clinton did not win, even though I fully admit I had expected her to win, and many of us at the Hindu American Foundation were pivoting in that direction in terms of engagement with a future administration. And as the course of the administration, the Trump administration went along, in the first year, I felt that this president is actually achieving things that he said he would to the American people. Not everything, and it most certainly isn't, a smooth ride, but he was achieving things. And post 2018 midterms, I saw this politicization or this division within American society, especially amongst the political elite, getting far more polarized, and it was extremely distressing to me, especially to see an untruthful impeachment proceeding that was executed by Speaker Pelosi. And I feel that I'm a disaffected Democrat. So I won't carry on for too much longer so we can move on. But I feel I am a disaffected Democratic voter. I never was, officially registered with the party, but, I felt for the most part that Democrats did represent me. But until 2016, I have to say that that notion had been broken in my own mind. And I think that is reflective of what I was hearing and seeing within the Hindu American community. And I feel that drift is happening much more rapidly now in the advance of the 2020 election. And I look back to my parents who immigrated here from India, but as Hindus, and the India that they left was a Nehruvian socialist economy that did not provide opportunity for my parents, and so they came here in America or they left America. They went to the UK first, but then eventually they came here to America to seek that opportunity. And I fear that for myself, or more importantly for future generations, that America is not going to be here if the Democratic Party, and more importantly the far left of the Democratic Party, becomes more powerful in American political classes. And so that is what brought me to this journey, and I'm sure we're going to unpack much more of that throughout this conversation. So thank you so much.
Jay, thank you for leading in terms of the introduction. I will keep my comments very brief. I identify strongly as a Hindu American. My faith has been central to my identity since I was a young child, and I credit my family for instilling in me strong Hindu values. I am indebted to my wife and her family for reaffirming those Hindu values. And more importantly, I've considered myself not just a progressive in terms of my politics, but someone who, as Jay pointed out, and Vineet also noted, will provide a voice and fight for my community. What I mean by my community is the larger Hindu American community. Oftentimes, I think mistakenly, people use the term Hindu and Indian interchangeably. And I feel very strongly that we as a community are more diverse culturally, ethnically, socioeconomically, and geographically. And so when I fight as a Hindu American, particularly fighting on behalf of this campaign, it's advocating, again, there is a significant Indian American Hindu population, no doubt. But I'm also fighting for the large Indo-Caribbean Hindu community, the Nepali Hindu community that's been displaced by the 2015 earthquake and lost their temporary protected status under this administration. The Hindu frontline workers who have been affected by the pandemic, whether they are Hindu doctors from India or Sri Lanka, or nurses and frontline medical workers from Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, South Africa, and Fiji. So I speak to the wider Hindu American community's concerns. And to Vineet's point, when we talk about our Dharmic values and the central Hindu concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence, and do no harm, this administration has done a lot of harm. And I understand there are people in our community with strong first-generation ties who feel a connection to India, and I'm not going to disparage that. But as someone who is from this country, who experienced what it was like to be a religious minority in this country, a frequently ostracized religious minority in this country, I speak passionately to why the Biden-Harris ticket would be such a positive for our community. On a personal note, I've known Joe Biden since his days as a senator. I covered him when I was a journalist. And the conversations we had, we didn't have in-depth conversations, but the conversations we had conveyed to me the depth of his empathy. So beyond the fact that, yes, I'm a Hindu American, I'm a Democrat, I also do have a deep personal connection to this campaign from that previous relationship. And I also do want to give credit to Jay, because Jay and I have had some long conversations. We've agreed to disagree, but it is the spirit of civility and mutual respect that we sought to convey in our conversations.
I think with the recent passing of Justice Ginsburg, I think one of the most compelling aspects of her life is the close relationships that she held with somebody who is on the complete opposite spectrum, also on the bench, but whom they shared a very close personal relationship outside of their professional lives. That's the model that I hope that we can emulate here today in her honor.
Beautiful, beautifully said. Thank you so much. And thank you both for helping to give us that human face of what brings you to the work that you do and the support that you are offering to each campaign. I want to pick up on something that Murli touched on, and I want to direct this question to you, Jay. And I also just want to ask that, again, let's try our best to really be succinct with these answers so that we can, have as much robust conversation. We also hope to open this up to questions from our participants. We have over 80 participants on Zoom, and I'm sure more on YouTube and Facebook. Those folks can always chat me as the host privately, and I can try to curate and moderate those questions. But let me get right to sort of some more specific directed questions. And I'm going to pick up on something that Murli raised and directed it towards you, Jay. Murli sort of hinted at the call for Hindu Americans to sort of stand in solidarity with other folks who have been perhaps wronged or harmed by this administration. And it seems like there is a history, whether it's a real history or a perceived history, of the Trump administration being one that has sort of fanned the flames of anti-immigrant and xenophobic rhetoric. How does that complicate the Hindu case for Trump, particularly since so many Hindu American communities also identify very strongly as immigrant communities? How do you answer the charge that Hindus ought to stand in solidarity with immigrant communities and other folks who are sort of marginalized minorities, rather than to put their support behind the president?
So part of the work that I did at the Hindu American Foundation was work on immigration reform measures that were important to our community. And one of those measures is trying to rectify the green card backlog. Now, it is true that Speaker Pelosi passed the bill that has attempted to rectify it, and unfortunately, I don't think the Senate will pass it because of other concerns. However, consistently, and I would even say this is true in the Senate right now, consistently the objections have come from the far left of the Democratic Party, and even amongst broader South Asian groups who tend to ignore or tend to demonize Hindu voices within their own ranks, or they try to subdue them or get them to submit to their broader agendas. Consistently, they've been against the green card backlog reform, and I would even be so brazen to name Ilhan Omar as one of those voices, where I've heard from many sources, anecdotally, of course, I was not in these meetings, but that she deliberately disparaged Indian immigrants who would be the largest block of Hindu immigrants or green card holders if this legislation was able to pass. And so I would like to just push back on that notion that this president is necessarily just anti-immigrant, or xenophobic. I believe and from what I've seen and what my interactions with this administration, just as a community activist, not as necessarily a campaign surrogate. By the way, I'm not a campaign surrogate. I do not represent the Trump campaign. I am simply a community member who believes very strongly, and I wanted to present my perspectives here. So I just wanted to disclaim that. President Trump stands for legal immigration that will support and bring added value to the economy. And when Hindus are disparaged in these circles, be it the South Asian circle or be it the far left, I feel far less empathy from the Democratic Party as a whole. And I've not spent any particular time with Joe Biden, so I wouldn't be able to speak to his own personal persuasion on this, but at least the party that he is seeking to lead, I feel far less empathy from them on addressing my concerns as a Hindu American or as the descendant of immigrants. So I would leave it at that for now.
Yeah, thanks. Let's pick up there, and I'm going to call on Murli here. Murli, let's flip the script a little bit, and let's pick up on what Jay's pointing out, and what I'm hearing as a kind of a lot of support for the South Asian community, broadly defined, coming from the Democratic Party, but a real absence of empathy for Hindu Americans in particular. And here I just want to point at something that folks have been talking about a little bit around Vice President Biden's kind of very notable sort of expression of care for the Muslim American community, particularly through the Agenda for Muslim American Communities, document, and folks in the Hindu American community kind of asking, where is his agenda for us? So how do you think, or how do you respond to this criticism that, okay, the Biden-Harris ticket may be a positive one, arguably, for South Asian Americans, but when it comes to the specific, as you said, religious Hindu American identity, there's a real kind of like conspicuously absent sense of care or empathy?
I think it does a real disservice by ghettoizing these notions of Hindu identity and Muslim identity as being intrinsically or exclusively from the Indian subcontinent and its various geopolitics. I'm not a fan of rhetoric and statements and petitions. I don't sign petitions. I don't necessarily think statements of concern have any sort of tangible policy impact. It's actions that matter. And one of the things that's really important for us to understand as the Hindu American community, regardless of whether we're from Gujarat, Guyana, or Grand Rapids, Michigan, is to understand that when we look at various faith communities, they have their own socioeconomic, geographic, cultural, and racial diversity. So when Joe Biden puts out a statement to the Muslim American community, keep in mind that until the mid to late 1960s, the majority of Muslim Americans in this country were African American, largely due to the rise of the Nation of Islam in 1931 with Elijah Muhammad. Now, that in of itself is an interesting tension within the Muslim American community, I understand. Up until the 1980s and 1990s, the majority of Arab Americans were Christian until immigration changed that. And then in the last 10 to 15 years, demographically, we have seen a shift more to Muslim Americans whose origin is from the Indian subcontinent, whether it's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. So the Muslim American community does have that social diversity. The Hindu American community has growing diversity, but there's also this whole idea, well, why don't we have a separate statement for Hindu Americans? We can, if we're also willing to acknowledge the diversity within our community. This can't be, we can have it both ways. We want to be identified interchangeably as Indian and Hindu and not recognize the diversity within the community. That being said, just keep in mind what this campaign has already done in terms of its outreach to the Hindu American community. We had a Hindu prayer session at the DNC. We have started Hindu Americans for Biden and have featured prominent, proud Hindu Americans who are willing to fight and advocate for this campaign. And most importantly, we have a man of faith himself who understands deeply and uniquely the challenges we face as Hindu Americans. Joe Biden, as a senator, visited the Mahalakshmi Temple in Delaware when it first opened nearly 20 years ago. And he understands that the Hindu American community is a growing voice in this party. You know, one thing I'm not, again, a huge fan of is this idea that we need to constantly issue statements. Let's act. The Biden campaign responded to the Hindu American Political Action Committee's questionnaire, the first presidential campaign in, since HAPAC was started, to respond to the questionnaire fully. They have started Hindu Americans for Biden and have done numerous other initiatives to reach out to the Hindu American community. And let me just add one more thing. Under the Obama-Biden administration, a record number of Hindu Americans served in high-ranking roles. And we need to understand those actions cannot be downplayed.
Thanks, Murli, and thank you, Jay. Since the conversation has in a number of ways touched on this already, perhaps we can more explicitly explore what is this connection between Hindu American identity, Indian American identity, and then India as a nation state and as a political entity and actor. And so there are real questions around, and this is something I would love to hear both of you speak to. There are real questions around how much either candidate's positions on India, particularly around sort of very hot button issues, whether we're talking about Kashmir, whether we're talking about constitutional amendments, whether we're talking about kind of communal tensions generally, where do those concerns play into the decision-making of Hindu Americans come November? And why don't we, Murli, why don't you, since you started to touch on this already, why don't you start us off and then perhaps we can pass it along to Jay?
Sure, Vineet. While I have urged us not to keep thinking of Hindu Americans and Indian Americans as interchangeable, since I would argue that there are many Indian Americans who are Sikh, Muslim, Christian, atheist, Jain, who have just as strong of an identification with India as the nation state as their Hindu American brethren do. And obviously, as I mentioned, there are Hindu Americans who are not of any form of Indian descent, even those who may have found Hinduism at some point in their lives, I'm sensitive to perceptions that Indian American Hindus, particularly folks who are first generation, have about, hey, this city council drafted this resolution about India, or this person said that. I'm sensitive to that. I understand that that can seem like a slight at the community. But one thing that I'm cautioning all of us to do is step back and say, how much of this connection, when we're talking about Indian American identity to India, is also driven by this idea of partisan patriotism? You know, I don't like to get into conversations in which let's just put it in terms of Indian American Hindus, our Indianness is somehow in direct correlation to our fealty or support for whoever the ruling party in India might be. The same thing for the United States. I covered 9/11 in the aftermath of the attacks and the ways in which many immigrant communities were being ostracized. And our patriotism was scaled based on our partisan allegiance to Republicans and our scale of willingness to criticize then President Bush. This happens to a lot of immigrant and expatriate communities. But I will say that despite what some people have been sharing in terms of their concerns or spreading on WhatsApp message groups, just look at the actions. Look at the commitment that Vice President Biden has made in terms of a strong partnership with India, ensuring that cross-border terrorism is addressed, and using the strategic support of India to counter the growth of Chinese aggression across South and Southeast Asia. So again, let's just step back and understand that rhetoric, especially when we're talking about resolutions and tweets, might be cause of sensitivities for some in the community, but actions matter. And there hasn't been anything tangible that the Trump administration has done to build on the accomplishments of the Obama-Biden administration when it came to strengthening that US-India relationship.
And thank you, Murli. And I think this is where we will have to agree to disagree, but allow me to extrapolate on that. Number one, if we want to speak about actions, specifically when it comes to Vice President Biden, many forget, or it's kind of buried in the pages of news from many years ago, that Vice President Biden, shortly before he became vice president, was awarded the Hilal-e-Pakistan, the Crescent of Pakistan, because of his landmark legislation as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Pakistan Economic Development Assistance Act. Now, in the aftermath of 9/11, ravaged by years of war, the Biden, a Biden-led Senate, and he also did this in conjunction with, what I feel is another global, a globalist-minded Senator Richard Lugar of then Indiana. He's since been voted out of the Senate, but they wrote this landmark legislation because they believed that Pakistan should be, economically developed, that would be the key to ending extremism and terrorism within Pakistan. But unfortunately, that has not been the case. Over $30 billion of U.S. aid money has gone to Pakistan over the course of several years. And unfortunately, that money has actually been misappropriated or redirected to actually further military aggression in Afghanistan, which is actually a travesty because that's been directed mostly at American and NATO allied forces instead of clamping down on the support of the Haqqani network and other terrorist networks in Pakistan, and also to perpetrating terror attacks against India. So while I did read the Hindu American PAC's the responses the Biden campaign provided to the Hindu American PAC, and I must say that that's a lot of rhetoric when the actions of the past decade and a half of the Vice President Biden has been diametrically opposite to that. And in addition to aggression of Pakistan, the Trump administration did halt considerable funding, and they've scrutinized every penny of American taxpayer aid that's gone overseas. And they actually did something that administrations in years past failed to do, and that's label Pakistan a country of particular concern. Now, there's much room for improvement in the Trump administration to actually levy the sanctions necessary on Pakistan for its designation as a country of particular concern. And for those in the audience who are not aware of what that distinction means, it is to sanction countries where religious freedom violations are particularly egregious, and where minority communities have suffered just insufferably. And the Hindu community of Pakistan, of which I have worked very closely with and which I keep in contact with to this day, and also in countries such as Bangladesh as well, where the growth of radical Islamic terrorism and also the embrace of those ideologies in civil society in those countries has gone unchecked for way too long. And unfortunately, US aid dollars has contributed to that. The other issue that I think a lot of Hindu Americans, and even those of Nepali origin or from other parts of the diaspora, Pakistan, Bangladesh, fear is that China has become this monster in their own backyard, and that's unfortunately due to much of the advocacy that Vice President Biden or even as Senator Biden did on their behalf, whether it be to admit them to the WTO, whether it be to further engage them on trade, and the pivot, and Obama's pivot to Asia, unfortunately gave China the upper hand, in which India right now is having to fight them off on its border. Bangladeshi Hindus, from what I hear, are very concerned about China becoming more, and just Bangladeshi society in general is becoming more concerned about the leadership there cozying up to China, and what that and the ramifications that has on them, and in Pakistan as well, whether it be in the province of Gilgit-Baltistan, where the China-Pakistan economic corridor flies through, the displacement of indigenous communities in those parts of the world has unfortunately been exacerbated because of Vice President Biden's advocacy and support for strengthening a relationship with China without accountability and without reasonable measures of concern. So.
Thanks, Jay. Let me just continue from there, because there are some folks also asking in the chat box. So I'm going to try to combine some of the questions that are coming in, which all seem to be, or many of them seem to be, kind of gravitating towards the same thread. So I hope to do this justice. That is basically the critique that it sounds like from what you've described so far, that really at the crux of your position is a kind of concern specifically around Hindu minorities in other countries generally, and Pakistan in particular. And so the critique, I guess, asks, is this not sort of a short-sighted and very single issue approach to a very complex candidate, a very complex party, that might that not be blinding us to some real concerns with President Trump and with the Trump administration that kind of, might be construed as, might be seen as a win for the Hindu American community in the short run, but might actually speak to a larger concern. And I'm going to take that further and combine that with another question, which essentially asks, there are those who see sort of Hindu support for Trump in particular, or even the right generally, as a kind of an unspoken shared Islamophobic outlook, this kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Is that a fair criticism? And how do you respond to that?
Sorry, I try to mute myself in between so as to not interrupt. But the criticism, so let me take the first part before I answer the broader question. This criticism that Trump is in some way Islamophobic or is there's a shared interest between Hindu Americans and the Trump administration for that is just as egregious as this overused accusation in the left that Trump is a racist, and whereas there's actually record support for President Trump, and this is just an objective observation. And this is really what started opening my eyes to why President Trump is the right person for the job, man or woman. It doesn't matter to me. He has record support from African Americans, from Hispanic Americans now, and from other minority communities, including the Hindu immigrants, as we can broadly define them, whether that they be, the vast majority of them are from India, but they could be from the Indo-Caribbean, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Fiji, or they may have migrated outside of India generations before, and are more connected to countries such as East Africa. But President Trump is actually getting record support from them, because I feel it's not just about foreign policy. I also think it's about the America that we all want to see. And unfortunately, the left, just in the past few months, in the aftermath of what is being accused as police aggression, but I would like to allow the courts to litigate that and to mitigate that, because there are aspects of those cases that we as just citizens are not privy to, even with the widespread use of social media or videos of such quote altercations. But the sheer destruction that the left has imposed upon American society, that in no way, shape, or form is reflective of Dr. Martin Luther King's message to those seeking equal justice and civil rights, of whom he was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. And in fact, I've actually been in touch with Hindu business owners whose businesses have been torched or destroyed because of this mass rioting. So it's not just how President Trump is carrying out foreign policy or his gestures towards, Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Let's just call it for what it is. It's actually and I think I'm going to say this, and hopefully it gets memed and tweeted about, but foreign policy is such a misnomer, because for many decades since World War II, foreign policy of America has been to intervene in other people's domestic policies, and to some degree that was happening before, but I feel that's happening even more so now, that other countries' foreign policies, including China and I would say even Islamist regimes across the world, is to intervene in American domestic policies. And I would actually like to see President Trump be more aggressive about Islamist organizations that are operating in the United States at the behest of nefarious foreign powers that are trying to sow the seeds of division in American society. And he's just started that process just recently by labeling or by forcing Al Jazeera to register as a foreign agent who, as they are acting on behalf of the Wahhabi Qatar government. So that is, so it's not just about foreign policy, but it's also about the divisions that are so palpable in American society, and I think they're being exacerbated by nefarious state and non-state actors around the world.
Jay, there are many who would say that President Trump has been first and foremost the actor who has exacerbated and leveraged existing divisions and perhaps even sown seeds of further division. And so, I mean, briefly, I wonder how you respond to the, you mentioned wanting to look at sort of objective reality. How do you respond to those who say objectively, when we look at kind of the emboldened, particularly white Trump supporters acting out in ways that there are now cases upon cases of Trump supporters acting out against racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, even coming to, as one of the folks in the chat box asked me to ask you, specifically directed towards Indian Americans, and many of whom may be Hindu Americans, with this kind of rhetoric of go back to your own country, that this is not your country. Do you think that is, that's a false narrative or fake news, so to speak? Or do you feel like there's some truth to that accusation, that we have seen a deepening of division, particularly on racial, ethnic, and even religious lines?
So thank you. There's a little bit to unpack here, so if you can bear with me. One of the ways that one of the things that we've just completely ignored in this conversation is the fact that we had a presidential candidate who openly identified as Hindu in the Democratic primary, Tulsi Gabbard. And unfortunately, standard bearers of the Democratic Party chose to demonize her. And there's an entire nexus of support, to a nexus of nefarious groups and actors that are demonizing her, either for her Hindu beliefs, identity, her very well thought out foreign policy positions, or her ability to discern, truth from untruth, and abstain from voting in the erroneous and false impeachment narrative that Speaker Pelosi, imposed upon the country. And there's been no major support. There's been no cry of support for her from the ranks of the Democratic Party. And she's a Hindu of non-Indian origin. She's from the state of Hawaii, of half Samoan, half Caucasian racial makeup. And nobody's come to her. Nobody of any merit has really come to her defense. And I was personally very supportive of her candidacy, and when she bowed out, I was publicly relatively politically neutral, because I wanted her to go as far as possible, and I was under the impression that she was going to try and take it to the convention. But as the pandemic was drawn out, the convention was essentially a non-entity, or it was very clear very early on that the convention may not even happen. And she endorsed Biden, because that's what she said, that, she said she pledged during the primary process she was going to endorse Biden. And I view that as kind of almost like Bhishma Pitama in the Mahabharata, who had to pledge loyalty to the Kauravas because that's what he had to do, or that's what he pledged he would do. And so I feel like she is essentially falling on her sword, and she's a decorated military veteran, and she's served in wars in Iraq, and her positions to try and instill peace in the Middle East through negotiation, through dialogue, through trying to talk to people, that are not necessarily, going to be given the Nobel Peace Prize, or nor should they be, but engaging in a dialogue to prevent further loss of life of American soldiers, that was demonized, and she was essentially ostracized from the Democratic Party. Going forward on your topic of whether Trump has fanned the flames of division, I would say that yes, there was most certainly this reaction from the extreme elements of society, and we saw that with the hate crime that was perpetrated in Kansas of the murder of Srinivas Kochibutla. But I worked personally with the Republican governor in Kansas, and I worked with the DOJ, and we made sure that there was a hate crime prosecution, and he was convicted and he was put on death row. And also President Trump mentioned that incident in his first joint address to Congress. And also I noticed on the Biden webpage, there is an outreach to Indian Americans, and so I mean, morally, for all intents and purposes, the Hindu community has essentially been subsumed into that identity by the Biden campaign itself, with regards to like explicit political platform. And I remember there's a line in there about the hate crime in Kentucky against the Hindu mandir. I went to that mandir, and I invited the governor of Kentucky, then a Republican, Matt Bevin, to attend the cleanup, the paint over the hate ceremony, because the mandir was just sprayed with graffiti. It was gross, grotesque, and whatnot. But the Republicans came out and they supported us, and they have effectively changed their perspective on hate crimes as that they do exist. And I would say this Department of Justice is just as aggressive, if not more aggressive, about prosecuting hate crimes as was Obama, because I've seen it. I've worked with the Attorney General under Jeff Sessions, and not so much under Bill Barr, but I've got to say, for Attorney General Jeff Sessions, very aggressively prosecuted hate crimes, and so I don't take it lightly that this president is trying to unify America as Americans, and there's often there's often a hesitation amongst the Republican or the right, so to speak, to hyphenate Americans, and we can decipher that and look, I'm a Hindu American, my Hindu identity is as important to me as my American identity, but I've got to push back on that notion that this president is necessarily fanning these flames, while unfortunately voices of reform, whether it be within the African American community or within the Muslim community, are often silenced by those on the left, or they're deemed to be Uncle Toms or ineligible to speak on behalf of their communities just because they do not submit to the dogma of the left. And that, unfortunately, is the reality which we're facing, which has exacerbated this polarized, this polarization of American society.
All right, thank you for that answer, Jay. And you've put a lot out there. I want to give Murli an opportunity, at least, and I apologize, we don't have so much time remaining, but I want to give Murli an opportunity to kind of respond to that, and to share his perspective, and perhaps a perspective from Vice President Biden's approach to that same division that we're seeing in our country today.
Thanks, Vineet, and thanks, Jay, for your unpacking. I'll just reply succinctly. Trump is a racist. He's been a racist for most of his life. I mean, ever since he and his father was sued by the Housing and Urban Development for racial discrimination in their buildings in New York. He is a racist, and he's also an arsonist when it comes to democratic norms. Now, Jay correctly pointed out there are incidents in which we have seen some of the protests perhaps get out of control. But over 90% of protests following the death of George Floyd and in response to the ongoing calls for justice in the deaths of people like Elijah McClain, Breonna Taylor, and of course, more recently, Jacob Blake, have been peaceful. And when you're talking about why so many Americans, particularly Hindu Americans, are concerned about this president, I look at a story I have always valued from scripture. And that is the story of Prahalada and Hiranyakasipu. Hiranyakasipu was the king who said, I cannot be killed by light or night, outside or inside, etc., etc. But Trump has made himself seem like he's above the law. He's been corrupt. He's supported white nationalists by saying both sides had good people following the Unite the Right rally. He's praised the Confederate flag and called it a symbol of Southern heritage. He's attacked affordable housing guidelines that were encouraged to bring out socioeconomic diversity in suburbs across the country, making a false link between crime and diversity when the stats don't back any of that up, claiming that if you're a person of color who votes, particularly vote by mail, you're committing fraud. Trump's America, and Jay, I understand where you're coming from in terms of the points you've made, but Trump has imagined America, an America that is white and Christian. And yes, there are people who support him who are people of color. There's no doubt about that. But he has imagined a homogenous society and used racial and cultural divisions to his advantage. Trump is trying to fight a culture war while thousands of Americans die every day, and we've lost already about 200,000 Americans to the pandemic. And he just sits in the White House and watches Fox News. And when we're talking about what this means to us, particularly as Hindu Americans, we value satya, or truthfulness. And this is a man who every time he lies and is called out, he doubles down with an even bigger lie. And that is fundamentally evil. No one is expecting Vice President Biden, should he win in November, to become a miracle maker. But what we all expect is some restoration of civility, some degree of stability, some degree that our president isn't going to get unhinged and release a tweet storm that could impact policy and affect the lives of millions of Americans. So I think in the Hindu American case for Joe Biden, we know that no president will ever be perfect, but someone who's honest about the fact that he's not perfect, who, in the words of President Obama, whose administration might have some false starts and missteps, at least can openly acknowledge those mistakes and live in reality. That's all we want, not the alternate reality that President Trump has surrounded himself with. And so going forward, I think what we need to look at is, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, is this what you want? And as Hindu Americans, central to our philosophical premise is seeing divinity in all. And after 4 years, can we honestly conclude that President Trump sees the divine in all of us? This is a man who hates his base. And we're expecting him to be a great friend of Hindus, or as he likes to say, a quote, big fan of Hindu. So that's my basic response.
Thanks, Murli. So much there to unpack, and I'm sure we could keep going on that track. I do want to be cognizant of the time, and I want to switch gears a little bit as we wind this conversation down, and I'm doing my best to also keep up with some of the questions in the chat box. Let's switch gears a little bit. Both of you, I think, if I understand correctly, both of you not only identify strongly as Hindu Americans, but you also identify, if we can say generationally, as very much sort of embodying this second gen Indian American experience. I think Murli and Jay, you might have mentioned this as well, this sort of like that first generation strong ties, and then we're also seeing a kind of a second generation sensibility. Now shifting and looking specifically at that sort of second generation sensibility, if you could, if I could ask each of you to give us your best sort of very short, like whatever it is, 30 seconds to a minute elevator pitch, specifically directed at your fellow ABCDs, so to speak, for why Trump or Biden better represents them and their interests. Jay, why don't you start us off?
Thank you. So I define ABCD as American-born confident Desi. I'm not confused about any part of my identity, and I don't think the vast majority of those in my generation or of my ilk are confused. They live in dual worlds, and they live in a world in which they may have dual identities, but ultimately their identity as an American enables them to think clearly beyond the politicization and the polarization of much of what the media and others want to portray on us. And I would encourage second and now third generation voters. I mean, I have a nephew who was born in America, my sister's son, who is going to vote in the election this year. I encourage them to look beyond the sensational media headlines and dive into the substance, whether it's record job creation, bringing back jobs from China back to the United States, whether it's making peace deals such as the one last week between it was called the Abraham Accords, the recognition of Israel as a sovereign state by Gulf countries, in which that is going to cascade throughout the Middle East. Instead of sending soldiers to war, creating more trauma in the lives of American families throughout the heartland, including Hindu American families who have served in the military and are wounded veterans or suffer from PTSD, or respecting American and foreign partners' sovereignty as a basis by which to negotiate, with the world at large, and also for ensuring that America is a place where dreams and opportunities are afforded to all. And I would just like to add one more last tidbit, is that Kamala Harris, she just, I think it was last week on Grandparents' Day, that she announced that she was proud of her father for defending Indian freedom. She said that he's a freedom fighter. She's walked back that statement because of whether he was actually in the freedom fighting movement or not. But while Gandhi's statue in Washington, D.C., Mahatma Gandhi's statue was being desecrated in early June, she was actually bailing out violent rioters and those who were, and I agree that the vast majority of people who take to the streets calling for justice are peaceful, but there are violent protesters. And unfortunately, they have caused innumerable damage to American infrastructure and streets and across cities around the country. And is that the type of double speak that we want, instead of a president who's going to stand with law enforcement, because law enforcement is going to get called when Hindu mandirs are damaged or when there's a hate crime. So I know I added a lot more in there than I intended to, but thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Jay. Morley?
My quick elevator pitch is to my fellow Hindu Americans who are second and third generation. Many of us know what it's like being bullied for our beliefs, bullied based on representations or misrepresentations in our textbooks. Donald Trump is that bully. He bullies people he perceives are weaker. You know, for him, winning means strong. And being someone who is marginalized means being weak and a quote unquote loser. This is a person who's trampled upon our democratic norms and these ideas of mutual respect. And for all of the violence, for all of the deaths that have happened from the pandemic and the causes over racial injustice, these have happened under his watch. So if he wants to take sole credit for America's job creation, maybe he should take credit for all the jobs that have gone under his watch and the economic collapse we're now staring at ourselves and the racial and social unrest across the country. You can't take credit for the good things and absolve yourself of responsibility for when things go wrong. And so my pitch is, do you want a president who actually leads in times of crisis or just sits around and tweets and watches Fox News while the country burns around him, and who sows the seeds of division, fear, and mistrust? That's my pitch.
If I may, I might just say that President Trump has been doing more than watching Fox News. He actually answers questions from the media every day, which I was. Look, I made my decision a bit late in this campaign cycle, but that's one of the reasons why I think President Trump is the guy for the job, because he can take the heat from the media, and unfortunately, Vice President Biden is a bit absent.
He's also told us to inject bleach. So in those Q&A sessions, spouting off nonsensical medical theories does nothing to help either. So I see your point, Jay.
Well, as we come to a conclusion, I wanted to harken back to something we spoke about way at the beginning, which was this spirit of wanting to be strong advocates for our position, but also be good listeners, also engage in the best of civil discourse and civility. And I think while strong feelings have definitely come up, and while there is much to discuss, there are points of agreement, and there are just as many, if not more, points of disagreement. I want to thank you both for really modeling that kind of civil discourse and showing that it's possible to have conversations like this. In that spirit, I want to just close with asking each of you to share one thing that you have really appreciated learning from or hearing from the other side this afternoon. And Morley, maybe you can start us off, and then we'll pass it along to Jay.
My conversations with Jay over the years have always been modeled on respect. It's hard for us to demonize each other when we see the other in ourselves. And whatever happens on or after November 3rd, we still have to exist as fellow Americans. And it's really about this idea of mutual respect that's enshrined in our Hindu scriptures that I try to live up to. And again, because I've known Jay for so long, this is probably nothing more than a spirited disagreement among friends. And I hope that as family members continue to decide whom they're going to vote for in this election, that their feelings don't overwhelm them. They can't see the humanity in their fellow Americans, their family, and their friends.
Morley is one of the best advocates that Vice President Biden could have on his team from our community. And I'm very proud to say that he's been a friend and a colleague, and for him to be in such an exalted position on the Biden campaign is an honor, to be on the same platform as him. And he has always approached his job, from what I saw at HAF, with conviction and passion, and he brought that out today. and there's no doubt in my mind that he's going to continue to use that passion and conviction to advance the interests of our community, whether it be on this platform or any other platform. So, I look forward to further conversations on a public forum with Murali about a plethora of different topics, because, because it's important to have this dialogue. We're all in this together, as Murali said.
Thanks for convening the conversation, Vineet. That's really an important step forward for our entire community.
Well, thank you both for those words. What a wonderful way to bring our conversation to a close. Again, I want to extend my thanks on behalf of the Princeton University Hindu Life Program to the two of you, as well as to our partners at the Dharmic Life program at Georgetown University, as well as the Hindu Life program at Yale University. We're just getting started. This is perhaps the beginning of the conversation rather than the end of it. And my own hope for all of us as a community, for those who do identify with this community, or even folks who may not identify so much with the Hindu American community, but who are deeply interested in some of the values and principles and teachings that arise from the Dharmic traditions. Wherever we land on this, my hope for all of us is that we can have more conversations like this in the lead up to the election. And then, of course, as Murali, as you were saying, whatever happens on November 3rd, let's keep thoughtful, meaningful, substantive conversations going November 4th and beyond. So again, thank you all so much. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, a wonderful week to come, and we wish you the best going forward. Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Namaste.